The morning Isla Quinn got fired, it rained so hard the gutters overflowed, and the street outside the unemployment office looked like a river that had forgotten its place. She stood under the awning with her cardboard box of desk belongings pressed against her chest, watching water pour off the edges of the roof in silver curtains, and thought, "This is fine. This is absolutely fine." Except it wasn't. It hadn't been fine for a very long time, and pretending otherwise was a habit she'd developed the way most people developed bad habits. Slowly, then all at once, until one day you couldn't remember what honesty felt like. 3 years at Harwick Publishing. 3 years of arriving early and leaving late. Of covering for colleagues who took credit and gave blame. Of smiling at editorial meetings while Marcus Webb, her supervisor, presented her ideas as his own and accepted the applause with the easy grace of a man who had never once doubted his right to take up space. 3 years of telling herself it would get better. That patience was a virtue, that the right opportunity would come if she just worked hard enough and kept her head down and didn't make waves. The box held the evidence of that time. A coffee mug with a chip in the handle she'd never gotten around to replacing. A small succulent named Gerald, who had survived 3 office relocations and 2 restructuring announcements. A framed photograph of her mother taken on the pier in Brighton, squinting into summer sun, laughing at something just outside the frame. Her mother had died 8 months ago. Ela still talked to the photograph sometimes, late at night when the apartment felt too quiet, and the silence had a texture you could almost touch. The redundancy letter had been brief and corporate, and had used the phrase restructuring of departmental resources 3 times, without once mentioning her name. Marcus had shaken her hand afterward with genuine seeming regret and said she was incredibly talented and the industry would be lucky to have her, which was the sort of thing people said when they wanted to feel good about doing something unkind. She hadn't cried. She'd thought about it, had felt the pressure building behind her eyes the way weather builds before a storm, but something had hardened in her chest, and she'd simply nodded and picked up Gerald and walked out. The rain was easing now, settling into a fine mist that clung to everything and turned the city soft at the edges. Ela looked at her phone. 14 missed calls from her landlord, the rent she was already 2 months behind on, and now this. She had £432 in her current account, and approximately 0 prospects, and a succulent named Gerald, who looked faintly judgmental in the way that small plants sometimes did. What she needed, she thought, was a plan. What she got instead was a card. It appeared on top of her box between one breath and the next, slipped there by a woman in a dark coat who moved through the misting rain without getting wet, which Isla noted distantly as strange but not strange enough to comment on. The woman was striking in the way that made you look twice, and then look away, features too precise, too arranged, like a portrait that had stepped off the canvas and learned to walk. She was gone before Isla could speak, folded back into the crowd and the mist as if she'd never been there at all. The card was heavy stock, the color of old cream, and had no name on it. Just an address in a part of London Isla didn't recognize, and 3 words in ink the deep red of garnets. Come tonight. Midnight. She should have thrown it away. She knew that with the practical certainty of a woman who had grown up reading cautionary tales and understood that mysterious invitations delivered by women who didn't get wet in the rain were categorically the sort of thing you declined. She put it in her pocket instead, picked up her box, and went to find a bus home. She told herself she was curious. She told herself it was probably nothing. A gallery opening or a pop-up event. The sort of overly theatrical marketing campaigns that were fashionable these days. She told herself a great many things over the following hours, sitting in her small flat with Gerald on the windowsill and the photograph of her mother propped against the kettle. Eating toast she didn't taste, and watching the rain slide down the glass. At 11:15, she put on her good coat. At 11:40, she was standing at the address on the card, which turned out to be a building in Mayfair, with no signage, and a door the color of old blood, and a doorman who looked at her with the kind of eyes that had seen considerably more of the world than his face suggested. She gave her name. He stepped aside. The interior was not what she expected, which was beginning to feel like a theme. She had expected a restaurant, perhaps, or a private members' club with leather chairs and the discreet clink of crystal. Instead, she found herself in something closer to a ballroom, pulled from another century. Ceilings that arched overhead in pale stone, candelabras burning with actual candles, walls hung with portraits of people who watched you pass, with expressions that didn't quite settle into anything human. There were perhaps 200 people in the room, dressed in a register that made Isla's good coat feel like a costume from the wrong production. And at the far end, on a chair that stopped just short of being a throne, sat a man who made every other person in the room seem like furniture. She felt him before she saw him properly, a pressure in the air, a shift in the room's gravity. He was tall even seated, dark-haired, with a face that would have been called beautiful, if beautiful didn't sound too soft, too approachable for the precise and dangerous arrangement of those features. He held a glass of something dark and wasn't drinking it. He was watching the room with the patient, measuring a tension of something very old that had learned not to show its teeth too quickly. Isla didn't know then what he was. She only knew that when his eyes moved across the crowd and found her, standing at the entrance with her good coat and her complete wrongness for this room, something in her chest performed a maneuver she hadn't authorized and couldn't quite explain. She lifted her chin. He watched her do it. The corner of his mouth moved, barely, not quite a smile, and Isla Quinn, who had been having the worst day of her life, walked into the room and thought, well, this is something else entirely. His name was Aldrich Voss, and he had ruled the Nocturne Court for 643 years, which was long enough to have developed very specific opinions about human nature, and very few remaining sources of genuine surprise. He had watched empires construct themselves from ambition and collapse under their own weight. He had attended the courts of kings who believed themselves eternal and had outlived every one of them. He had learned 17 languages, lost count of the number of wars he'd witnessed, and developed an expertise in patience that was less virtue than survival mechanism. The understanding that nearly everything resolved itself if you waited long enough and didn't flinch. He was not often surprised. The woman at the door surprised him. Not because of how she looked, though she was striking in the particular way of women who didn't know it and therefore hadn't learned to perform it. Dark-haired, pale, with eyes that moved around the room the way experienced readers moved through complex text, quickly, looking for the thing beneath the surface. Not because she was human, though the Nocturne Court admitted very few humans and never by accident. She surprised him, because of what she did when his gaze found her. Most people, when Aldrich Voss looked at them directly, experienced a response somewhere on the spectrum between discomfort and terror. It was the weight of centuries behind the eyes, or so Madame Petra, his seneschal, had explained with the clinical detachment she brought to everything. You look at people like you're deciding, she'd told him once. And no one wants to feel decided about. He'd thought that was probably accurate. The woman at the door had felt his gaze land and had lifted her chin. Not in challenge exactly, or not only in challenge, in the manner of someone who had recently been having a very difficult time and had decided, at some point in the last few hours, that they were done being diminished by circumstances. He recognized that particular quality of stubbornness. He had seen it survive things that killed more obvious forms of strength. He had Petra send someone to bring her a drink and find out who she was. The report came back during the second movement of the evening's entertainment, whispered at his shoulder by a young attendant who was still learning that information delivered to the king should be succinct and should never include one's personal opinions on the matter. Her name was Isla Quinn. She was 28, recently unemployed from a publishing house in the city, 2 months behind on rent, recently bereaved. And she had received a courier card that afternoon. She had come alone and had told the doorman her name with the slightly defiant air of someone who expected to be turned away and had decided to act unbothered about it in advance. Aldrich considered this. The courier cards were Petra's system, an old one, used when the court required something specific from the human world. He would have to ask Petra what she'd been thinking. He didn't ask Petra about the card that night, because what happened next reorganized his priorities considerably. The trouble began with Lord Cassius, as trouble at the Nocturne Court so frequently did. Cassius was 300 years old, and had confused longevity with wisdom in the way that certain vampires did, mistaking the accumulation of time for the accumulation of judgment. He was elegant and precise, and casually cruel, in the manner of someone who had never once had to consider consequences, and he had taken it upon himself, midway through the evening, to make the human woman uncomfortable. Aldrich saw it happen from across the room, Cassius approaching with his social smile and his particular talent for identifying exactly the wrong thing to say, and saying it with perfect courtesy. He watched Isla Quinn receive whatever Cassius opened with, saw her expression move through something and arrive somewhere flat and controlled. He watched Cassius lean closer, press some advantage, use the trick of physical proximity that he used on everyone who didn't know to step back. Aldrich was already rising from his chair. Then, Isla Quinn did something no one in 643 years had done in his court. She slapped Cassius across the face. Not a glancing thing, not a flinch that became contact. A real slap, clean and deliberate, the sound of it cutting across the music and the conversation like a blade through silk. The room went silent so completely, it was as if someone had removed sound from the air. 200 vampires, some of the most dangerous creatures alive, froze in the particular way that predators freeze when something unexpected happens and they haven't yet decided how to respond. Cassius stood with his head turned to the side, one hand rising slowly toward his cheek, his expression cycling through shock and fury, and something else. The dawning awareness of audience, of how this moment would be remembered. Isla Quinn stood with her shoulders back, and her chin up, and her hand still raised, breathing hard through her nose, looking not at Cassius, but past him, at the wall, at nothing. The way people looked when they'd just done something enormous and were still catching up with themselves. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. The silence held, stretched, became the kind of silence that had weight and temperature. He was aware of every eye in the room, moving between the woman and the king, waiting to see what the moment required. He had not survived 643 years by being predictable. He smiled. It started at the corner of his mouth, where the almost smile had been earlier, and it moved slowly, deliberately, until it reached his eyes, which he permitted to show actual amusement for the first time in what felt like years. The room did not know what to do with this. You could feel the recalibration happening, the collective exhale, the scramble to read the king's response and adjust accordingly. Lord Cassius lowered his hand from his cheek and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. When the king smiled, you had lost. Aldrich set down his glass on the nearest surface and walked across the room toward Isla Quinn. She didn't run. He noted that, first, before anything else, the way she held her ground as he crossed the room toward her, the crowd parting around him with the instinctive deference of water, finding a new course. He was aware of the spectacle of it, of 200 pairs of eyes tracking this approach with various calibrations of shock and hunger and gleeful speculation. The court loved nothing better than an incident, and this was shaping into something considerably more interesting than an incident. But she didn't run. She watched him come with those direct, reading eyes, and he could see her working the situation out as he moved, processing the silence and the smiling king, and the fact that she had just assaulted a member of vampire nobility in the court's own ballroom, and to her credit, she arrived somewhere closer to braced than terrified. He stopped 3 feet from her. Up close she was more interesting than across a room, which was not always the case with people. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of several months of inadequate sleep and the particular quality of recent grief that sat in the body differently than old grief. Her coat was good, but tired. She smelled of rain and something warmer, cardamom perhaps, and underneath that, the specific human warmth that was either the most complicated or the most straightforward thing about them, depending on your century. "What did he say to you?" Aldrich asked. His voice came out quieter than the room expected, pitched for her rather than for the audience, and he saw her register that. The small adjustment it required. She held his gaze. He made a comment, she said, about women who arrive at certain kinds of parties alone, about what they're usually looking for. Her voice was steady, which cost her something. He could see the cost of it in the slight tension along her jaw. "So you hit him," Aldrich said. She met his eyes fully then. "I've had a very long day." The silence broke, not into chaos, into something stranger and in some ways more dangerous. 200 vampires processing the fact that their king was amused, genuinely amused, in a way that most of them hadn't witnessed in living memory, which in their case covered rather a lot of ground. He heard the sound move through the room like wind through grass, the exhale of a collective breath, the creak of recalibration. Lord Cassius had retreated to the edges of the room with the stiff-shouldered dignity of a man performing indifference very badly. Aldrich made a small gesture, and the attendant appeared with 2 glasses. Real wine this time, not the theatrical dark liquid he'd been carrying all evening. He took one and offered her the other, and she looked at it for a moment with the considering expression of someone deciding whether accepting a drink from an unknown host in a deeply strange situation constituted a reasonable choice. Then she took it. Good, he thought, without entirely knowing why. "Tell me about your long day," he said. It wasn't what she'd expected him to say. He watched the surprise move through her face before she controlled it. "You're the host," she said. "Shouldn't you be attending to your guests?" "Most of my guests," he said, "have been attending my events for upwards of a century. They require very little. You, on the other hand, have just created the most interesting moment this court has seen in approximately 40 years. I feel some responsibility." She almost smiled. The shape of it moved across her face and then thought better of itself and retreated, which he found more interesting than if she'd simply smiled. "My day," she said, "is not a story I'd tell a stranger. You struck a stranger," he pointed out. "That's different." "How?" "Because he'd earned it," she said, with a simplicity that was not simple at all. He considered her. The room had resumed a low hum of conversation, the court performing discretion while in fact attending to every syllable. He was accustomed to being watched, to performing even private moments on a stage. What he was not accustomed to was finding the performance less interesting than the person in front of him. "What is your name?" he said, though he already knew it. She paused, reading the situation again, deciding something. "Ela," she said. Ela Quinn. His name moved through the room before he said it, carried on the breath of 200 people who'd been watching for the moment he'd choose to reveal himself. "Aldrich," he said. "Voss." He watched her process the reaction of the room, watched her look around at the stillness and attention his name produced, and watched her arrive, with the methodical intelligence he was beginning to appreciate, at the understanding that she had walked into something considerably larger than a party. "What is this place?" she said. Not a question exactly. An assessment. "His court," he said. "And what you are," she said. "All of you." He had told humans what he was many times over 6 centuries, had watched them respond with every variation from frenzy to catatonia. He waited now, curious for the first time in a long time about what a specific person's reaction would be. "Very old," he said, "and currently very interested in you, Isla Quinn." She looked at him for a long moment. The candlelight moved in the draft from the high windows and threw shadows across the angles of his face, and he let her look, let her take the measure of him without performing anything, which was not a thing he offered many people. "I think," she said slowly, "that I should probably go home." "You probably should," he agreed. She didn't move. Neither did he. The space between them had the quality of a sentence that hadn't yet found its end. Around them, the nocturne court waited with the patient hunger of things that had learned to wait for everything. She went home. Of course, she went home. She was a practical woman who had read enough to know that the correct response to discovering you'd wandered into a room full of vampires was to leave it. She left with her good coat and her empty hands, and the ghost of Aldrich Voss's attention on her back like a warm hand between her shoulder blades, and she told herself on the entire bus ride home that she was not going to think about any of it. She thought about almost nothing else for 4 days. Gerald the Succulent was an unhelpful audience for the circular quality of her thinking, offering neither judgment nor advice, simply sitting on the windowsill in the gray November light and being a plant. She thought about the room, about the particular quality of silence that had followed the slap, about the way 200 impossible creatures had looked at her with that specific cocktail of calculation and surprise. She thought about the smile. That was the thing she kept returning to, pulling it out and examining it the way you'd examine an object you'd found in an old coat pocket, trying to date it, understand what it was for. He had smiled like someone who had been waiting for something without knowing they were waiting, and then it had arrived, and the surprise of it was genuine. She was not a romantic. She had been a romantic once, in the way that most people were at 22, and had been educated out of it by the subsequent 6 years in the particular London way, through the accumulated small disappointments of professional undervaluing and the specific ache of watching your mother become less and less herself until one morning she simply wasn't there anymore. She had practical responses now, and clear eyes, and a working knowledge of the difference between what things appeared to be and what they actually were. The card came on the 5th day. Same heavy stock, same garnet red ink. This time it said simply, "The position is still open, if you're interested." She turned it over. Nothing on the back. She put it on the kitchen table and made coffee, and stood looking at it while the coffee brewed, and had what she would later describe as a brief but comprehensive argument with herself about the nature of reasonable behavior and the specific circumstances under which a recently unemployed, twice bereaved, nearly evicted woman might be justified in reconsidering her definitions of it. She picked up the card. She wrote an address on a piece of paper and went to find her A to Z. The building looked different in daylight, which was her first indication that the previous encounter had not been a peculiar dream. It was actually there. Actually, Mayfair. Actually the color of old blood. The same doorman, who appeared not to require sleep or rotation. She gave her name. He stepped aside. This time she was taken not to the ballroom but upstairs, through corridors lined with art that would have required historians to properly contextualize, to a room that was clearly an office in the way that rooms become offices when the person using them has had centuries to accumulate the kind of books and papers and objects that needed organizing. Aldrich Voss was standing at the window with his back to her when she entered. He was dressed differently, less formally, still immaculate in the way of someone for whom immaculate was simply a baseline condition. He turned when she came in and looked at her for a moment before speaking. "You came back," he said. "You sent a card," she said. "I didn't know if you'd come. I didn't know if I would either." He indicated a chair. She sat. He moved to the desk but didn't sit, which she read correctly as a negotiating position and filed away. "There is a position," he said, "that the court requires filled." His voice was careful, deliberate. "I want to say first that it is legitimate employment, with a contract and specific terms. I mention this because the circumstances of our meeting were unusual, and I don't want you to feel that any obligation exists from that evening." She looked at him steadily. "What's the position?" "We require a human liaison," he said. "Someone with experience in publishing, media, communications. The court has considerable holdings in the human world, companies, publications, properties, that require management and interface that a human presence facilitates better than any of our own. You have editorial experience, contacts in publishing, and," he paused, "a demonstrated willingness to respond to provocation directly, which is a quality that is considerably more useful than it might appear in this environment." She was quiet for a moment. "You want to hire me because I slapped someone. I want to hire you," he said precisely, "because you assessed an unfamiliar situation with considerable intelligence, responded to genuine provocation without escalation beyond what was proportionate, and then left when leaving was the right thing to do. The slap was evidence of judgment, not temper. The judgment interests me." Isla looked at him. In 643 years, she did not know that number yet. She would learn it later. He had employed human liaisons 4 times. 3 had lasted an average of 8 months before the complexity of the situation had become something they couldn't sustain. He had not looked for a replacement in 11 years, which was long enough that Petra had stopped asking. He was not a man, she would come to understand, who explained himself. The fact that he was explaining now was information, though she didn't know enough yet to read it properly. "What are the terms?" she said. "A 1-year initial contract," he said, "renewable by mutual agreement. Salary significantly above market rate for the equivalent role. Full disclosure of the court's nature and operations. And," he added, with the precision of someone who had learned to say the difficult thing first, rather than letting it accumulate weight, "you would be under the court's protection for the duration of your employment. Which means," she said carefully, "which means that what you witnessed on your first evening, the response to Lord Cassius's behavior, is the standard here. No one in or affiliated with this court will trouble you. The city, for practical purposes, will be safer for you than it was before." She sat with this for a moment. "It's a very large thing to offer for a publishing liaison role," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him, and he looked back, and the morning light through the tall windows was doing something complicated with the room. "When would I start?" she asked. She started on a Monday, which felt appropriately ordinary for something that was anything but. Petra, the ancient woman from the first night, met her at the door with the energy of someone who had been waiting for this particular development and had arranged herself accordingly. Petra was somewhere between efficiently warm and warmly efficient, showing Isla the offices, the working systems, the human staff who managed the court's above-ground operations, and who ranged from completely aware of their employer's nature to existing in a state of carefully maintained professional incuriosity. Her office was a good one, proper daylight and tall shelves, and a desk that had clearly belonged to someone serious about their work. On it she found a set of folders detailing the court's holdings, 4 publishing imprints, 2 cultural magazines, a literary festival that had been running for 22 years, 3 bookshops in 3 cities. She sat down and started reading, and did not emerge for 3 hours, at which point she had 14 questions and the beginning of an organizational framework in her head. Aldrich appeared in the doorway when she was in the middle of her notes. "How long has the literary festival been running without a proper programming strategy?" she asked, without looking up. "Since its inception," Petra said from behind him. "Which would be," Ela said, 22 years of missed potential." She looked up. Aldrich was watching her with the expression she was beginning to identify as his interested expression. distinct from his neutral expression and his dangerous expression, and the very occasional expression she had no name for yet. "We have a meeting at 4, he said. "With whom?" she asked. "The board of the larger imprint. They've been making decisions Petra and I disagree with, and haven't found the right way to articulate our concerns." She looked at him. "You want me to articulate them? After 2 hours in this office. You had 14 questions in 2 hours, he said. "I'd like to see what you do with the board." The meeting was instructive. The board was 4 men in their 50s, who had the specific confidence of people who had spent decades being unchallenged in rooms they considered theirs. They did not expect her. They received her with the particular brand of polite dismissal that she had extensive experience navigating. The faint over-explanation, the questions redirected to Aldrich, the unconscious performing for each other at her expense. She let it run for 11 minutes, gathering data, and then she started asking questions. Not aggressive questions. Precise ones, the kind that required actual answers and revealed the gaps between what the board said they were doing and what the numbers indicated they were actually doing. By the end of the meeting, 2 of the 4 were sitting forward in their chairs. The other 2 were sitting back. She identified this correctly as the split she'd need to work with. Afterward, in the corridor, Aldrich walked beside her without speaking for long enough that she'd begun to consider whether silence was his default processing mode. "Then, you identified Hargreaves as the problem in the first 4 minutes." "I identified him in the first 90 seconds, she said. "I spent the next 2.5 minutes confirming it." He almost smiled. The almost smile was becoming familiar, like a word she was slowly learning to pronounce. "What do you need to fix it?" he asked. 3 months, and the authority to make recommendations directly, she said. "If your board thinks I'm advisory, they'll manage around me. If they think I have actual standing, they'll engage properly." He nodded once. Done. They walked on. Outside a window, the November city was doing its gray and yellow thing. Taxis and rain and office workers with their collars turned up. She thought about the 3 months before, standing under the employment office, awning with Gerald, and the card she'd almost thrown away. Strange how threshold moments looked like nothing from the inside. She had not yet had dinner at the court. An experience that she gathered was an event, but she had eaten lunch twice in a small dining room off the kitchens, where the human staff ate, and where a cook named Bernard made extraordinary soup and asked no questions, which she appreciated. She had not encountered Lord Cassius again, though she was aware of him in the way you were aware of weather systems moving at a distance. Petra had told her, with the economy of someone accustomed to delivering context without editorializing, that Cassius had been at the court for 300 years and considered himself Aldrich's closest advisor, and had been wrong about this for approximately 280 of those years. She had told Ela this while showing her the archive of court documents she'd need to understand, and had then moved on to cataloging the physical archive with exactly the same tone, which Ela appreciated in the way she appreciated all forms of useful information delivered without performance. She was good at the work. She had always been good at the work, which was part of what had made Harwick Publishing so maddening, the specific injustice of competence going unrecognized, because the person exercising it didn't fit the template of who was supposed to be competent. Here, she noticed, people paid attention to results. It was possible this was a vampire court thing, that 6 centuries of watching empires rise and fall had calibrated Aldrich Voss to care about outcomes over optics. Or, it was possible he was simply the particular kind of leader who had the confidence to value people who were better than him at specific things. She would come to understand it was both. On the 3rd week, she stayed late working through the literary festival archive, trying to understand what the event had been before it became what it currently was, which was a respectable but somewhat inert version of something that had once been alive. She didn't hear Aldrich until he appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, which surprised her into looking up. "You learned how to use the machine," she said. "I've been learning things for 6 centuries," he said. "Coffee seems within reach." She laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed properly since she couldn't remember when, since some time before her mother, since some point when life had still had enough margin in it for things to be genuinely funny. It moved through her like something loosening. A muscle she'd forgotten was clenched. He handed her the cup and didn't comment on the laugh. But she saw it register in that careful face, saw him file it away the way she filed things away, not for use, but for understanding. The court was its own education. She had read enough in the first week to understand the shape of vampire society, its hierarchies and laws, the structure that had evolved over centuries to manage the specific complications of beings who lived indefinitely and remembered everything and had a complicated relationship with power. She understood it academically before she understood it experientially, and the gap between those two types of knowing was considerable. The court's social mechanics were elaborate and old, and had the specific quality of systems that had originally served a purpose and then calcified into ritual long after the purpose had shifted. She could see this clearly in the way that an outsider always saw the interior logic of a system they hadn't grown up in, with the clean vision of someone who hadn't yet learned to find it normal. She started keeping notes, not formal ones, not reports. A private notebook she kept in her desk drawer, observations about how decisions were made, where the actual influence moved versus the ceremonial influence, which relationships were the operative ones. It was the same skill she'd used in publishing, the ability to read rooms and understand the difference between the stated structure of an organization and its functional one. Lord Cassius noticed her. She'd expected this, and had given it measured thought in advance. He was not going to forgive the slap. That was simply the reality of the situation. And she wasn't going to apologize for it, which closed off the obvious resolution pathway. What she could do was manage the dynamic with enough intelligence to prevent it from becoming a problem she couldn't work around. He began with small things, the redirecting of information that should have reached her, the meeting she wasn't informed of until it was over, the brief comment made in earshot about human fragility and the inadvisability of involving mortals in ancient matters. She documented each instance in the notebook and said nothing. She had learned from years of dealing with Marcus Webb that escalating early was the move your opponent wanted you to make. You waited until you had the complete picture, and then you made a single decisive intervention that addressed everything at once. She did not tell Aldrich. This was important. She was building her own standing in this court, and it needed to be standing she'd constructed herself, not standing borrowed from the king's attention. She understood, without anyone telling her, that the court was watching to see what kind of person she was, and whether the king's interest in her was explicable, whether she was, as the saying probably went in vampire circles, worth the trouble. She intended to be worth the trouble. It took 6 weeks to gather what she needed. In that time, she had restructured the management of 3 of the 4 imprints, proposed a 5-year programming strategy for the literary festival that Aldrich had read twice and Petra had described as comprehensive, and had figured out that the 4th board member who'd been skeptical of her in the initial meeting was simply a person who needed more data before committing to a position, which was a type she respected. She had also eaten dinner in the court twice, which was its own experience, the formal dinners that happened twice monthly being the court at its most ceremonially elaborate, and therefore its most revealing. She watched the politics of seating and conversation, watched who sought Aldrich's attention and how, watched how he managed the room with the particular economy of someone who had been doing it for a very long time, and had reduced it to the minimum necessary engagement. She noticed that he watched her across the table in a way he didn't watch other people, not with the assessing gaze he turned on his courtiers. Something different. Quieter. A kind of attention that felt less like evaluation and more like interest. She noticed this and filed it in the category of things she was not yet ready to think about directly. The Cassius situation resolved itself on a Tuesday. She had arranged it for a Tuesday because Tuesdays were court meeting days, and court meetings were the only time everyone who needed to witness the resolution would be in the same room. She walked in with her notebook and sat in her designated chair, which Petra had secured for her in the third week over what Petra described, with wonderful understatement, as some resistance. And when the item on the agenda reached the literary festival relaunch, she presented her findings. Calmly, with documentation. Including the documentation of the 6 weeks of systematic interference with her work, logged with dates and specifics, and in 2 cases, witnesses who had been willing to confirm what they'd observed. The room was quiet when she finished. A different quality of quiet than the ballroom silence. Less shock, more assessment. Aldrich had not looked at her during the presentation. He was looking at Cassius. Cassius, to his credit, did not attempt to deny it. He sat with the rigid composure of someone reminding themselves they were 300 years old and not going to be undone by a human woman with a notebook. "Is there anything you wish to add?" Aldrich said, to Lord Cassius. The question was quiet. The quieter Aldrich's voice got, she had learned, the more attention you should be paying. Cassius said nothing. Aldrich turned to her. "Thank you, Miss Quinn. The court will address this internally." She nodded. The meeting continued. Afterward, Petra caught her in the corridor and said, with the closest thing to warmth the ancient woman readily deployed, "Well done." From Petra, this was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. Cassius did not trouble her again. Winter became something different in the court than it was in the city outside. The city did winter in its practical London way, gray and damp and relentless, people moving through it with their shoulders up and their eyes on the pavement, managing in the court. Winter was ceremonial, marked by specific observances whose origins predated most human institutions, and whose meanings had accrued layers of significance over centuries, the way sediment accrued layers, each one pressing down on the ones below until the original rock was somewhere deep and not easily retrieved. She asked Petra about the winter observances and received a 3-hour explanation that she transcribed into her notebook and cross-referenced with 3 texts Petra pulled from the archive. She was building a map, she realized, of something enormous, the internal geography of a civilization that had been developing in parallel to human history, hidden in the interstices, present at events she'd only ever known from the human side of them. It was the most interesting thing she had ever done. This surprised her, given that she had loved publishing, had found genuine meaning in working with words and stories and the architecture of how ideas reached people. But this was different. This was the primary source. One evening in December, she found herself alone in the archive room past midnight, going through records from the 14th century that Petra had flagged as relevant to a current dispute over court precedent. The records were in 3 languages, and she was working from a translation Petra had provided, cross-checking it against what context she could gather. She didn't hear Aldrich until he set a cup of tea on the desk beside her. She looked up. He was in the chair on the other side of the table, with a book she recognized as the one she'd asked about 2 weeks ago, and assumed he'd forgotten. "You found it," she said. "I found it 3 days ago," he said. "I've been reading it. What do you think?" He looked at her over the book. "It's a generous account of events I remember differently." She studied him. "You were there." For the relevant chapters, yes, she sat with this for a moment. The archive was very quiet. The building around them was full of the particular nighttime activity of vampire households, but here, it was just the 2 of them, and the old paper, and the lamp pooling warm light between them. "What was it like?" she said. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, longer than books make it seem, he said. "Everything is." History compresses. It takes a day and makes it a sentence. Takes a year and makes it a paragraph. You lose the weight of it, the actual experience of living inside events that won't become history for another century. She understood this better than he might have expected, having spent 3 years at Harwick, watching Marcus Webb compress her work into his paragraphs and strip the living weight from it. "I know something about that," she said. He looked at her. She told him about Marcus, about the 3 years, about the slow accumulation of small injustices that had been individually survivable and collectively exhausting. She hadn't told anyone this in its entirety, had given people versions of it, the professional summary or the careful deflection. She told him the actual story. He listened the way he did everything, with complete attention and without performing it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He knew you were better than him." She looked up. "That's usually what it is," he said. "People who steal work do it because they can't do it themselves. The stealing is the admission." She thought about this. She had never framed it that way, had always located the failure somewhere in herself, the question of what she'd done wrong, why she hadn't been able to make them see. "I spent a long time," she said slowly, "trying to understand what I did to deserve it." "You didn't do anything," he said. "It was simply about his limitations, not yours." "Simple truths from a vampire king in an archive room at midnight," she said. He almost smiled. "I've had 6 centuries to observe human behavior. You develop some pattern recognition." She smiled properly this time, not the almost version she caught herself deploying as a protective habit. He looked at it, her smile, with an expression she filed immediately into the category she still had no name for. What he said next surprised her. "I want to show you something," he said. He took her to the East Wing, which she hadn't yet been in, past the formal rooms into something older, the architecture changing character, stone giving way to older stone. He stopped at a door and opened it onto a room that was entirely books. Not a library in any organized sense, but a room that books had claimed, floor to ceiling on every wall, stacked on every surface, organized by some personal system that probably made complete sense to someone who had had 6 centuries to develop it. In the center, a chair by a window, and on the window ledge, a small plant that she recognized with a shock of amusement as a succulent. She looked at it, and then at him. "Petra mentioned you'd arrived with one," he said. "I thought it might make you feel at home." She looked at the room, at the books, at the plant, and felt something move in her chest that was large and warm and complicated. He was watching her with the quiet attention that she had stopped trying to decode and had simply started accepting as a constant, the way you accepted weather, present and inexplicable, and occasionally remarkable. "Thank you," she said. "For all of this." He shook his head slightly, and what he said was, "I should thank you. For coming back when you didn't have to. For being exactly what you are, without adjusting it for the room." He paused. "I've had many people in this court who became something different in order to belong here. You simply remained yourself and let the court do the adjusting." She didn't know what to say to this, and so she said nothing, which was, she had learned, sometimes the most honest response. She had been with the court for 4 months when her landlord sold the building. The notice arrived by email on a Thursday morning with the breezy impersonality of institutional communications, informing her that the property had changed ownership and all existing tenancies would be reviewed, which was property language for the thing she'd been dreading since, before she'd even taken the court position. She was sitting at her office desk when she read it, and she sat quietly for a moment, letting the familiar weight of it settle. It was always something. You solved one thing, and the next thing was already in position. She had money now, proper money, enough to rent somewhere new without the desperate mathematics of the last 2 years. But she had been in that flat for 4 years. It had her mother's things in it, the books stacked in the spare room, The green chair her mother had read in every Sunday for as long as Isla could remember. Moving meant touching all of it, deciding all of it, which she had been able to defer while it stayed where it was. Petra appeared in her doorway at 11, which meant Aldrich had noticed something was wrong in the specific way he noticed things about her that she hadn't announced. She was still not entirely sure how he did this. "There's a suite in the East Wing," Petra said, without preamble, fully self-contained, frequently unused. "It has a south-facing window and what I believe you'd describe as a reading situation that would meet your requirements." Ela looked at her. "He's offering me a room. He's offering you permanent accommodation as a component of your employment arrangement," Petra said precisely, which were the words they were using for it. "It is entirely optional, and there would of course be no change to the contract terms either way." She thought about the flat, the green chair, the boxes of her mother's books. "And I'd be able to bring my things," she said. "All of them." Petra's expression said she was probably thinking about the volumes of material this might represent, and had already arranged for someone to deal with it. "Obviously," she said. She moved into the East Wing on a Saturday. Aldrich was absent for most of it, which she understood was deliberate, giving her the space to make the space her own, without his presence making it feel like an audience. What he had done, she discovered, was leave the door to his bookroom open, which connected to a small sitting room that in turn connected to her suite. And on the table in the sitting room was a bottle of wine and a note that said, in handwriting that was probably 500 years old in its formation, "Welcome properly." She put the photograph of her mother on the windowsill next to Gerald. She put her mother's green chair in the corner of the sitting room. She arranged her mother's books on the shelves, which were the right depth for them, which she did not think was an accident. Standing in the completed room, she felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could accurately date. The particular sensation of being exactly where you were supposed to be, which was not the same as happiness, but was perhaps its precondition. Aldrich found her there an hour later, standing with a cup of tea and looking at the arrangement of the room. "Good," he said, from the doorway. She turned. "It's exactly right," she said. "I know what I like," he said. "So do I," she said, and realized as she said it that she was not talking about the room. He was very still in the way he went still when something registered that he was deciding how to address. She had learned this stillness, the quality of his processing when he encountered something that mattered. "I should tell you something," he said. She waited. "I have been," he said carefully, "aware of you in a way that is not straightforwardly professional for some time." He was looking at her with the expression she still had no name for, and she understood now why she hadn't named it. She had been waiting until she was sure of what it was. "I know," she said. She could see the edge of relief in his face, the faint release of tension in someone who has been carrying something and finally set it down. "I wasn't certain you wanted to know," he said. "I've been going back and forth about it. I'm not interested in making you feel that this is anything other than a free choice, completely separable from your position here. Everything remains the same if your answer is no." She looked at him. He was 643 years old and was choosing his words with the care of someone who had learned that words, once out, didn't come back, and he was standing in her doorway being precise and honest and faintly uncertain in a way that she found unexpectedly moving, because she understood what uncertainty cost someone who had had centuries to calcify into certainty. She set down her tea and crossed to the doorway. He didn't move. Let her close the distance. Let her make the choice by how far she came. She stopped within reach and looked up at him. "Strictly as an observation," she said, from someone with only 28 years of pattern recognition to work with. "You've been unhappy for a very long time." He considered this. "Yes," he said. "So have I," she said. She reached up and touched his face, her hand against the angle of his jaw, and felt him go completely still under her hand. The suspension of something very old and very controlled, encountering something it wasn't prepared for. She had slapped this face in front of his entire court 4 months ago. She thought about that now, the chain of accidents and choices that had led to this doorway. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He exhaled. Then his hand came up and covered hers, and in the quiet of the East Wing with her mother's photograph on the windowsill and Gerald doing his steadfast succulent thing, and 4 months of careful distance finally closing, he said, very quietly, "Neither am I." She did not become a vampire overnight. She did not, in fact, become a vampire for a considerable time, and this was both a practical reality of vampire law, which had very specific provisions about the circumstances of human conversion, and a reflection of the particular pace at which things between her and Aldrich developed, which was the pace of two people who had both learned what it cost to rush into the wrong thing, and had decided to be careful even at the cost of slowness. What she became first was known. To the court, to Cassius, who watched with the rigid disapproval of someone witnessing something inevitable that they had failed to prevent, to Petra, who had seen it coming from approximately the 3rd week and had arranged matters accordingly with her characteristic quiet competence. The court's response was complex. There was a faction that approved, that found in Isla the kind of person they recognized as valuable, practical and perceptive, and unwilling to be impressed by performance over substance. There was a faction that disapproved on principle, for whom any human at this level of proximity to the king was a category violation that would need to be formally managed. And there was the largest group, the one she'd learned to identify as the truest reflection of any community, the people who were simply watching to see how it would go. She gave them things to watch. In the spring, the literary festival launched its new programming iteration, the one she'd been building since February, and it was the most attended in the event's 22-year history. 3 of the 4 imprints had improved their numbers by the end of Q1. The 4th was under new management, following a board restructure she had navigated with enough political precision that even the board members who'd been replaced had agreed, afterward, that it was probably the right call. She had built something, not Aldrich's something, her own something, within the infrastructure of the court, but distinctly hers, shaped by her own judgment and expertise and the particular vision she'd developed over 3 years at Harwick Publishing for what thoughtful cultural work actually looked like. She sat across from Aldrich in the evenings now, in the book room or in the sitting room with its connecting door, and they talked the way 2 people talked, when they had both separately spent years not having anyone to actually talk to. He told her about the 14th century, about the wars she'd read about from the other side, what they looked like from inside events that would take 200 years to become history. She told him about her mother, about the long, specific years of her illness, and the way grief worked differently than you expected, less like a wave and more like a weather system, changing, but never fully leaving. He listened to both kinds of stories with the same quality of attention, which she found over time to be one of the most radical things about him. His attention was equal. It did not distribute itself according to what was impressive, or significant, or likely to be useful later. It simply gave itself to whatever she was saying, completely. She had never had that before. Not from any employer, not from most friends, not even, in the honest accounting she allowed herself at night, from the people she'd previously been in love with, who had given their attention more selectively, according to what they wanted from the interaction. Lord Cassius made one final attempt in April, a formal petition to the court challenging the propriety of the king's relationship with a human employee on grounds of court law and historical precedent. She heard about it from Petra at 6 in the morning on a Wednesday, delivered with the expression of someone who found the timing mildly inconvenient. She appeared at the court meeting at 9. She had prepared her arguments on 3 hours of sleep and Gerald's silent support, and had cross-referenced them against the archive documents she'd spent 4 months quietly studying for exactly this contingency, because she had understood from the beginning that this moment would come, and she had chosen to be ready for it when it did. The petition required response from the individual being petitioned about. She gave one. Standing in front of the full court, she addressed each of Cassius's grounds with the specificity of someone who had done the research and the calm of someone who had decided in advance that she was going to be fine. She was not Aldrich's dependent, she said. She was not the court's guest, or its decoration, or its problem. She was its employee, with a contract and a record, and that record spoke for itself. She placed the documentation on the formal table. 12 months of outcomes, restructuring results, festival numbers, imprint performance, court benefit calculated in human world terms and vampire court terms both. Then, she addressed the historical precedent Cassius had cited and explained, with the precision of someone who had read the actual records rather than the received summaries, why it didn't apply. When she finished, the room was quiet. Aldrich had said nothing throughout, which was his right as king, and also, she knew, a deliberate choice. His way of letting her stand on her own ground. His expression when she looked at him was the one she had finally named, somewhere around January, lying awake in the East Wing, with his warmth in the adjacent room. It was the expression of someone who was, against considerable odds, happy. The petition was dismissed. Cassius at last stopped. Summer in the court. She had been there a year now, had seen it through all its seasons, and could feel the difference between herself as she was now, and herself as she had been standing under an employment office awning with Gerald, and a box, and a borrowed card. Not a different person. The continuity was important to her. The same person, but with considerably more information, and a great deal less fear. Fear had been the background frequency of the previous 2 years. The constant low hum of not enough money and not enough recognition, and the specific dread of watching the person you loved most in the world become unfindable to herself. She hadn't noticed how loud that frequency was, until it was gone. Until she could sit in a room and simply think. Without the underlying noise of what if this falls apart, what then? Aldrich watched her settle into herself over those months, the way a careful person watched a plant establish itself in new soil, present and attending, but not interfering with the process. He had, she understood by now, an enormous capacity for patience that was not the same as passivity. He knew the difference between waiting and not acting. He had waited on things for 6 centuries and had learned something genuine about which things required intervention and which required trust. She trusted him. This surprised her more than it probably should have. She had not been a trusting person, or not straightforwardly, had always had the private caveat running, the background check of her own assessment, running parallel to whatever the surface of a relationship presented. With Aldrich she found the caveat dissolving, not because she had stopped checking, but because everything she checked confirmed the same thing. He was exactly what he presented. This was, she had come to understand, the rarest possible quality. Not the vampire king part of him, though that was extraordinary in its own specific way. The exactness, the fact that he said what he meant and meant what he said, and didn't require her to translate his behavior into its actual significance, because the behavior was already the actual significance. She had spent so many years working in environments built on the gap between presentation and reality that she had started to think the gap was universal, that everyone had one, that the correct approach to everyone was to read the gap first and the surface second. He made her reconsider this, which was not a small thing. He had been reconsidering things himself. She could see it in the way the court responded to him, a quality of lightness that Petra described, in her understated way, as notable compared to the previous decade. He smiled more. Not the controlled social smile of the court king, the genuine one that started at the corner of his mouth. He sat in the book room with her on evenings, when neither of them had obligations, and read in the same comfortable silence of two people who had established each other as good company. He told her about the things he had loved over 6 centuries, the music of 3 different periods, cities she could visit, and he would show her. The specific quality of light in certain parts of the world, in certain seasons that he had seen enough times to know when they were at their best. She told him what she would do with the literary festival over the next 5 years. He listened with genuine interest, asked real questions, pushed back on one element that she thought about for 3 days, and then conceded he was right about, which she told him directly, because she had always been able to do that with him, and it remained one of the things she was most grateful for. The question of what she would become came up in July, on a night when the city outside was warm, and the windows were open, and the book room was full of summer darkness, and the occasional sound of traffic from the street below. He didn't raise it. She did. Which felt right. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what I want." He looked up from his book. She had thought about this carefully. She had thought about her mother, about the green chair, about the years of watching someone you loved become someone you could no longer reach. She had thought about time, about what she would do with more of it than any human life offered. She had thought about the work, the festival and the imprints, and the things she wanted to build that would take longer than her current biology was going to give her. "I want to stay," she said. He was very still. "Here, specifically," she said. And in the longer sense, he put the book down. She held his gaze. She was not a romantic, or not only a romantic, she was a woman who thought carefully about what she wanted, and had learned the hard way that wanting the thing wasn't enough. You had to choose it precisely and without ambiguity. "I'm choosing this," she said. All of it. He reached across the space between them and took her hand and held it with the careful strength of someone who has learned to be precise with power. "There are laws," he said, "things I want you to know and decide with full information." She said, "I know." She had spent a year in the archive. He smiled, slowly, the one that was genuine. "Then, we have time," he said, "to do this right." "Good," she said, "because I intend for it to be right." The conversion happened in autumn, 1 year and 11 months after she had stood in an employment office doorway, and a woman in a dark coat had slipped a card into her cardboard box. Autumn felt right, the season of change framed as color, the ending of one thing pitched as the most beautiful moment in its existence. She had learned enough about vampire ritual by then to understand the significance of timing, and had chosen it herself, which Aldrich had said nothing about, but which she knew mattered to him. The agency of it. The fact that it was her calendar, and her decision. She spent the morning before at her mother's grave. Aldrich drove her, and waited in the car without asking to come, understanding that this was hers alone. She sat on the grass with the flowers she'd brought, and talked to the headstone the way she always did, telling her mother about what she was going to do, about Aldrich and the court and the work she was building, about the literary festival that was about to announce its largest programming year yet. She told her mother she was happy, which was the thing she had most wanted to be able to say, the thing that had felt like an impossibly distant country during the long illness years and the year of grief and the months of quiet desperation. She was happy. She wanted her mother to know. The ceremony was private, only Petra and 2 witnesses required by court law, in the book room because she'd asked for it, because that was where she felt most herself in this building. She wore her own clothes. She held Aldrich's hand through most of it. Petra performed the ancient words with her usual precise solemnity, and when it was done, Ela Corvinus, formerly Quinn, understood what the word changed meant when it was something that had actually happened to you, rather than something you'd observed happening to others. She was herself. This was the first thing she noticed, the fundamental continuity of who she was underneath all the physical transformation. The same mind, the same voice in her head, the same quality of attention, the same tendency to read rooms and ask questions, and push back when pushing back was warranted. But sharper, cleaner, as though decades of accumulated static had been lifted, and she could think with the full bandwidth of herself for the first time. She looked at the room and saw everything. The precise quality of candlelight, the titles of every book on the nearest shelf, Petra's expression, which was satisfaction, and something warmer she didn't show people as a rule. She looked at Aldrich. This was different. She had always been aware of him in the particular way of two people who had chosen each other and lived in proximity, an awareness that was warm and specific, and occasionally made it difficult to concentrate on imprint reports. Now she could feel the bond he had told her about, the ancient law of it, warm and actual, not metaphor but physics. The sense of him like a second heartbeat, steady and real, and completely his. He was watching her discover it, his expression open in the way it was only with her. "How do you feel?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "The way she did everything, like myself," she said. "Just more." He smiled. "Welcome," he said, "to a very long time." She looked at the room, at the books and the windows, and the succulent on the ledge next to her mother's photograph. She thought about the employment office awning, the rain, the card she'd almost thrown away. Every decision she'd ever made had contained within it the capacity to have gone differently, the moment where the other branch existed and was real. She had stood in the rain and chosen curiosity. She had come back when she didn't have to. She had hit a vampire lord in front of a king and held her ground when the king crossed the room toward her and said, with the voice of someone who had been a long time without surprise, "What did he say to you?" She had built her own standing in a court of ancient impossible beings and had read every document in the archive and had moved her mother's green chair into the sitting room and had told a 600-year-old man that she was not going anywhere. All of it had been her. Every choice, every decision to stay rather than retreat, every moment where she had assessed the unfamiliar situation and found it worth the risk. She was not a woman things happened to. She was a woman who happened to things, and she intended to keep being exactly that for as long as the word long could possibly mean. Aldrich was still watching her. They had all the time there was, stretching out ahead of them like a country she hadn't mapped yet, full of the kind of possibility that only existed when you were doing something real. She took his hand. "Shall we get back to work?" she said. His smile was the genuine one, the slow one, the one she intended to keep seeing for a very long time. "We shall," he said. And together, in the amber light of their book room, the Vampire King and his queen who had started as a woman with a cardboard box and a bruised hope and the absolute refusal to be smaller than she was, went back to building something that would last.